Second reading comes from the Gospel according to Luke, the 9th chapter, beginning with the 28th verse. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James and went up the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep. But since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he was saying. While Peter was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met Jesus. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. She was absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. Graceful beyond description, sweet as could be. She was a hard worker and would give you her undivided attention and loyalty. Her name was Cindy. She was my dad's bird dog. When the two of them went hunting, it was Cindy's job to help search out the birds and retrieve them for my dad. So when Cindy spotted the bird, she would freeze in place. She'd point with her nose, often raise her front leg as well, and her tail would be horizontal. She would maintain that position until my dad was ready and gave her the signal to go. Cindy was very good at her craft. Some might say too good. She would retrieve my dad's birds along with birds of other hunters if she got to them first. It wasn't that dog's job to point to herself. Her role was to direct my dad to something beyond herself, to her fine-feathered friends, as it were. At its most basic level, the Christian life is designed to point beyond itself to the one in whose name we gather and in whose name we serve. One theologian goes a step further to say that the Christian life is about being called to be a disappearing act. It's not about us. It's not about our educational degrees or our skills or our accomplishments or who we know or how many friends on Facebook we have. It's about what we do to point others beyond ourselves to the person of Jesus Christ. 3 of the disciples learned something about that on a mountaintop one day. Luke writes that Jesus goes up the mountain to pray, taking Peter, James, and John with him. The disciples are sleepy, but they manage to stay awake, and it's a good thing they do. Otherwise, they would have missed this indescribable experience. While Jesus is praying, the appearance of his face changes, His clothes turn lightning white. He's transfigured, he's transformed right before their eyes. None other than Moses and Elijah join him in conversation, saying something about Jesus' upcoming departure in Jerusalem. So Peter, good old Peter, springs into action, wanting to capture the moment. It's great that we're here to grab this. Let's build 3 dwellings, 3 sanctuaries, one for you, Jesus, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. We can make this pilgrimage back here regularly and invite all our friends and families. So Peter is still speaking when he and the others suddenly find themselves enveloped in a cloud. They hear a voice that says, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And then the cloud dissipates. The disciples find Jesus standing there alone. No Moses, no Elijah, no dazzling white. And Luke writes, they kept silent. And in those days, they told no one any of the things they had seen. Now, Matthew's and Mark's versions of this story have Jesus instructing the disciples not to tell anyone about what they'd seen. Don't tell anyone about this brilliant revelation on the mountain. Not yet, anyway, because there's work to be done. In other words, Jesus says, I don't want you to capture this radiant love in a kiosk up on a mountain. I don't want you to capture love. I want you to be love. I want you to point to the one who is love itself. And as soon as they come down from the mountain, the work begins again. The crowd presses in on Jesus. He gets right back into the thick of it by casting out a demon from a young boy. And Luke says all were astounded at the greatness of God. The transfiguration of Jesus is a pivotal moment in the gospel story. In some circles, today is often called as a swing Sunday. It swings between the season of Epiphany and the season of Lent. It's the culmination of all that has come before this mountaintop experience, all of the epiphanies that have told us who Jesus is and who sent him. And it's the introduction into the next leg of this Messiah's journey, namely his journey to Jerusalem and all that awaits him there. But the Transfiguration is a story that's hard to take in, much less know what to do with it. Let's face it, it's otherworldly. I don't know about you, but I think it would not have been hard at all not to speak about it. Had I been one of the disciples back then, there would have been no words to describe the experience of having seen Jesus in all his radiance, the experience of heaven and earth coming together. But Jesus didn't want them talking about it. There was work to be done then and now. Our job is not to capture love. Our job is to be love. Our job is to point beyond ourselves to the one who is love itself. Someone has compared followers of Jesus to lightning bugs, little blinking transfigurations that spread their light far and near. If you capture a lightning bug and you put it in a jar, it dies. It needs to be out and about doing what it does best. So we come together to worship and study and to support one another, and then we depart to serve out there, pointing beyond ourselves. As one preacher puts it, we trust that something happens every Sunday that has the potential to change everything, to give us a glimpse of the world that God intends, to show us who we really are, children of God. And then we literally act out the world that we pray would come. A world marked by love and grace, a world that offers forgiveness and a chance to start over, a world where people reach out to make peace, a world where our offerings of self and resources are taken up to serve others, a world where the gifts of God's goodness are placed in every hand, a world where the ethics of public life are kindness and compassion and justice. How we point beyond ourselves and to what we point matters. So as the story goes, the driver was making her way along a city street one day when the traffic light turned yellow just ahead of her. So rather than speeding up to beat the coming red light, she did as she was supposed to do, dutifully slowed to a stop just before the crosswalk. The driver behind her, who incidentally had been tailgating her for some time, was more than a little furious that she had stopped on the yellow light. He laid on his horn, screamed in frustration, and offered a hand gesture toward her as well. And as he continued to rant, the second driver heard a tap on the window. He looked up into the very serious face of a police officer. The officer ordered him to exit his car with his hands up as the first driver continued on her way when the light turned green. Police officer took that irate driver to the police station where he was searched, fingerprinted, photographed, and put in a holding cell. After a couple hours, the arresting officer approached the cell and opened the door. He escorted the driver back to the booking desk where the driver's personal effects were waiting for him. The officer said, "I'm very sorry for the mistake, sir. You see, I pulled up behind your car while you were blaring your horn and flipping off the driver in front of you and cussing a blue streak at her. And that's when I noticed a couple of your bumper stickers. What would Jesus do? And follow me to Sunday school. And I also saw the chrome-plated Christian fish emblem on your trunk. And so, given those things and observing your behavior, naturally, I assumed that you had stolen the car." How we point beyond ourselves into what we point matters. This week, coincidentally, on Ash Wednesday, the Supreme Court is set to hear a case involving a 40-foot concrete cross that has stood on public land in Maryland for nearly 100 years. It's named the Peace Cross and serves as a memorial to 49 soldiers who died in World War I. Opponents of the memorial say it violates the separation of church and state. Proponents contend that it honors the war dead and that if this cross is removed, then all crosses are in peril. So in everyday life around there, local folks will tell you that the cross is used as a reference point in traffic reports. And the King Pawn Shop refers to it regularly in giving directions to its store. They'd hate to see it go. It's a fascinating case, regardless of where you come down on whether the cross should be there or not. Closer to home, in a few moments we'll hear from Dan Terpstra about the First Presbyterian Church mission team that just returned from Belize. Dan and Dave and Peggy will tell you it's not about them. It's about those water systems that are making a difference in the lives of those who rely on them daily. Whatever we do in and with our lives, as Christians, we do it in response to what has been done for us. We point to the ongoing grace we experience. We point to the constant mercy that is shown to us daily. We point to the unending love that is showered on us each and every moment of our lives. That grace and mercy and love are in abundant supply. Peggy Haddon, our newest member, will tell you that. She'll be 100 years old in July. She's still basking in God's goodness, and she continues to point beyond herself to her generous Creator. As someone has noted, when we've spent time with God, it can't help but show. It is not just about prayer and Bible study and worship. You participate in a local building project and can't help but show some of the pictures on your phone to others. Your enthusiasm is contagious. You help a child or an adult learn to read. You sit at the bedside of a sick loved one. You attend the funeral of a friend who touched your life. All of these things move you, and that shows on your face and in your actions in such a way that someone else might notice, whether they comment or not. The real question is not about the experience. The real question is, what will we do? Who will we become? And to whom will we point as a result of it? Season of Lent begins 3 days from now. Once more, we will walk with Jesus as he makes his way to Jerusalem, where he will be killed and he will be raised. And the invitation is to take the dazzling moment of transfiguration, whether we understand it or not, and tuck it into our hearts as we head down the mountain and into the valley, pointing the way as we go. It will serve us well to remember that moment of light in the midst of the somber days ahead. May it be so for you and for me. Amen.